Criswell's an interesting guy because when he came to the church, he came under two conditions. He said, the pulpit has to be mine. He said, I've got to be free to preach whatever I want, whatever I feel God tells me to. And secondly, the staff have to be mine.
This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and joining me is Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Good to be with you once again, Samuel.
Always a pleasure, Richard. I see you've got a book in front of you. And
I do. A biography.
A biography. It's one of my favorite types of episodes that we do is look at leaders throughout history, and most of the time I haven't read whatever biography you bring, and this time is no different. I will mention before we get into it that you can still use the coupon code LEADER at blackabyinstitute.com for 10% off the online class, The Seasons of God, and that was based on your book, The Seasons of God, and we did some filming and some teaching videos that go along with that. That's part of the class. And
epic film.
Yeah, we filmed it in all 4 seasons, so it took about a year plus to put together, but it was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, the winter season here in Georgia is not much different than fall or spring. But sadly there was no snow for that filming.
I know, so it's a little thinner there at that part, but but people found that very, very interesting, just considering what season of your life and your ministry, your leadership are you in right now, and seasons change, and you might still be operating in a season that's already over for you, and then wondering why you're kind of frustrated that things aren't working out as well.
Right.
And sometimes you're in a season of planting, but we want to be in a season of plucking and harvesting, and so you're going to be set up for failure if you don't know what season you're in. Things won't work the way you would hope they would.
Exactly. And it's such a helpful framework for just thinking about and orienting your life, your work, your family. So make use of that while you can at blackabyinstitute.com. We'll leave links for that in the show notes. But today we've got a leader biography.
Yeah, and I'm going to go a little differently this time. If you're a pastor, or certainly if you're a Baptist pastor, then the name W.A. Criswell is going to be familiar with you. Maybe younger generations now might not be as familiar with him, but when I was growing up, he was in many ways the ultimate Baptist minister. He was ultimately became famous as a pastor, senior pastor at First Baptist Dallas, and I thought maybe we just kind of look at his life. He was a pastor, but he was also just a very influential person, and in many ways, ultimately he would build what arguably was the largest Baptist church in the world, as well as the largest Baptist church in the Southern Baptist Convention. And so he became quite admired and respected, and he exerted an influence in several key areas that continues on to this day. But also, I just found his life interesting because a lot of the kind of questions about history pop up with his life that are just interesting to look at. And so there is a recent biography by O.S. Hawkins, came out just in 2024, called Criswell, His Life and Times. And Hawkins is basically going to follow Criswell. There'll be one person that spends about 2 years pastoring between the two, but Criswell, according to this book, had a vision, a dream that Hawkins would be his replacement. And so, interestingly, Hawkins ultimately does become his replacement for several years. He's not there anymore. But so this book is written by someone who greatly admires Criswell, and also as an insider who got to know the Criswells personally. He was the pastor when Criswell died, and he oversaw his funeral and so on. Knew Mrs. Criswell. So he knows a lot of the inside stories of this world-famous person. And, it's interesting. It made me kind of wonder about who's the best kind of person to write a biography. This particular biography is a little over 200 pages long, so it's not a exhaustive biography. You know, Sam, I've kind of said a good biography needs to really be at least 500 pages to 1,000 to really go in depth. And so this biography at times strikes me as a little thin in details, and there's a lot of things I'd be kind of interested to know more about that he just doesn't get into. But because he's an insider, he does give some interesting insights into his life and stories you wouldn't have heard otherwise unless you just kind of knew the inside scoop on some things.
And I would imagine too that is going to be somewhat coloring the perspective of the biography.
And so there's
as well.
times where he'll talk about Criswell being the greatest of his age, and in very exalted terms, which at times sounds very much like a fan, someone that just really reveres him. And then to his credit, there's times where Hawkins will tell some less than flattering stories about Criswell, which make you think, oh, okay, well, he's not just telling you all the good and not any of the bad. He actually has some pretty less than flattering stories about Criswell and his family as well. And so for that reason, it's like you just, I think when you're reading a biography, you have to always kind of know, well, who is writing this? Is it written by someone that lived 100 years later and never knew him and just is researching in libraries and archives to get his information? Or in this case, it's someone who actually knew Criswell, knew the primary players, knew the inside story. And so he's going to obviously be biased in some ways, which is going to make it less than a completely objective biography. But at the same time, you're also going to get stories that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise, that wouldn't be in an archive. And so I think maybe later there might be another biography that's written perhaps a little more objectively as a little more time has passed. But anyway, I found this interesting and certainly probably the most informative biography to date now on Criswell. So a couple of things just to say about him. What you learn, and we've seen with other biographies, is that everybody's got baggage. Everybody comes from issues of their childhood that impacts them, and Criswell's certainly no exception. His mother is a very interesting person, and one thing you discover about Criswell is that probably the two most dominant people in his life is going to be his mother and his wife, and both will be very, very strong, domineering women that will. And in many ways, Criswell will spend his entire life submitting to the domination of one woman or the other. And so early on, his mother is a fascinating person. When she's quite young, she doesn't heed her father's advice, and she runs off with a traveling salesman, gets married, has 2 kids, and then sure enough, like her father warned her, her husband abandons her and the kids, and so now she's left to raise two daughters on her own. And she eventually marries a Criswell, who's a widower, and they take their blended family. They have one child together, and soon afterward, and that child dies. And then a year later, they have W.A. Criswell. And interestingly, they never give him a full name. He just has initials, W.A. And at times that was embarrassing to him, that if he had to give his name, and they'd always say, well, what does that stand for? And he'd say, well, I don't know. They didn't. They never gave me. All I got was some initials. And he's born technically he's born in Oklahoma, but it's actually a part of Oklahoma that used to be a part of Texas. And so he's going to move to Texas as soon as he can, and he'll see himself as a Texan. Of course, ultimately pastoring most famous church probably in Texas in his day, First Baptist, Dallas. But his mother is one of these. Maybe she was a helicopter parent long before that term was in vogue, but But her husband tries to farm, and it's basically he's farming in a dust bowl. It doesn't work. He loses the farm and tries several times to be successful in business, and just has a real hard time of it. Ultimately becomes a barber, has his own barber shop. But they live in kind of out of the way small town places initially. And so when Criswell's going to school, at a certain point when he's going to be going into high school and things like that, or even younger, she's concerned that the school that is nearby is not adequate for him, that she believes he's going to make something great of himself, and so she believes he needs a good education. And so at least twice, as Criswell's growing up, his mother will actually move with him to a bigger city so that he can go to a bigger school with more options. And her husband, of course, is a barber. He doesn't have lots of money. They can't really afford to own two different houses. And so she'll rent a place, move in. I mean, just, leave her husband back at their house. And she'll bake pies, she'll take in boarders, she'll do odds and end jobs, and basically just finance her and her son so he can get a first-class education. And she'll hire speech teachers, and she'll just do whatever she can to give him the best education possible. And she always believes in him. She always tells him he's going to make something of himself. And, sometimes we'll do that where it's all talk, right? Like you can say to your kid, oh, yeah, you could become a professional baseball player one day, or, you could become president one day. And that's fine to say that, but like she actually gets him tutors and gets him into good schools. And she pays a huge price, separated from her husband for long periods of time, so that he can get every advantage possible. She ultimately decides which university she thinks would be best for him, which was Baylor University in Waco, Texas. And I think she goes maybe the first year with him just to make sure everything's okay. And then finally lets him finish university on his own without his mother. She finally goes back to her husband. But early on, just a very dominant influence in his life. And it's kind of interesting about W.A. because eventually he'll graduate from university. He'll go to seminary and get his master's degree in divinity, and then he'll ultimately enroll in a PhD program. And I think in part he does that because for one, his mother always wanted him to be a medical doctor, and she kept telling him that he'd make a fine doctor one day. But the one sort of act of rebellion, I guess, of W.A. with his mother is he said he at a young age he already says, no, I'm going to be a pastor. And he just seems to not really quite sure even where he gets this from. But early on, as just a little boy, he already is telling everybody that one day he'll be a pastor. And so it's just ingrained in him. And so maybe to somewhat appease his mother, he does get a doctor's degree, but not in medicine.
Yeah.
But really, in his day, it's quite phenomenal to consider that even just to go to public, elementary school, his mother had to move to a different town to get him in a half decent elementary school, and now here he is getting a PhD, and he's ultimately going to become a leading, really a fundamentalist, very, very conservative, premillennial dispensationalist, but he's also going to be very, very well educated. Sometimes back in that day, if you were very, very conservative theologically, it often meant that you didn't have much education, that you were untrained. Maybe all I've got the Bible as my textbook. I don't need anything else. But Criswell was an anomaly in that regard because he knew Shakespeare. He loved to read. He loved to read classics. And he could quote long poems from English literature and other things as well as the scripture. And so it made him quite formidable in his day because he had very, very flowery language when he preached, when he wrote letters, when he spoke to people, very eloquent, and people just loved to hear him communicate. And so But what's interesting is all the way through college and even through his master's degree at seminary, he never dates anyone, never takes a girl out. And again, the author mentions that. He doesn't necessarily speculate why, just maybe he was so dominated by his mother. Maybe he was taking a break from women for a while, but ultimately, as he's getting his PhD, he realizes in his day that he won't be able to probably be a pastor of a significant church if he's unmarried, if he's single. And so he decides he needs to get married. He meets a young lady, Betty Harris, and she's quite a character. And the only person he ever dates, and he marries her. And she will replace his mother as the most dominant person in his life, not just female, but certainly no one is more dominant, influential in his life than she is. And so it's interesting. He pastors two different churches first in Oklahoma. And one of the things that's interesting about W.A. is that he has these kind of chance moments in his life. You could call them lucky, very timely, certain sort of just very opportune moments that are just turn the course of his history, his career. And one of those times is while I think he's a PhD student at the time at Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, and so he's attending a denominational meeting at some church, and then for some reason the scheduled speaker has to cancel at the last moment. So everyone's gathered, but the speaker's not coming. So for some reason, the person in charge turns to this young seminarian and says, "Could we get you to preach for us today?" And so he's come to the meeting not intending to speak at all, just to listen. And suddenly he has an opportunity to preach. And one thing about W.A. was that, especially as a young man, he just took every opportunity he had. And I've often said that to people that aspire to be a preacher or a pastor one day, is when you're young especially, just accept most invitations that come. I mean, you'll be stretched by it, but you need practice. You need experience. There's some things you can't just learn in a classroom reading a book. You just got to get out there and do it. And so he had always done that. He'd go down into the slums and just be preaching in the streets and just find people that would listen to him preach. And so that's how he kind of cut his teeth. And so on this day, he's asked to fill in for a canceled speaker. So he does, and he preaches a sermon that he calls 13 Reasons Why I Don't Believe in Tithing. And of course, that was a catchy title. He actually did believe in tithing, but it was his way of catching people's interest. And it just so happened that in that gathering were two very, very influential people. One of them was B.B. McKinney, that if you've ever sung songs out of a Baptist hymnal, he's got a bunch of contributions in there. He was a worship leader, a hymn writer. I believe he was a Southern Baptist, and he knew, he sort of was in the know with most of the influential people in the Southern Baptist Convention. The other person is a man named John Hill, and he's also a very influential person with the Southern Baptists. He lives in Nashville. And those two men just happened to be there that day, and both of them are very impressed with this young preacher that preaches on the spur of the moment. And so later, when Criswell graduates, this church is going to be looking for a pastor in Chickasha, Oklahoma, and they'll be asking B.B. McKinney, "Do you have any recommendations?" And he'll say, "Yeah, there's this guy that I met, young preacher. I think he'd do great for you." That's how he gets his first church, because he filled in preaching one day. Well, several years later, after he's pastoring his second church, First Dallas is going to be looking to replace their pastor, and John Hill is going to recommend. They're going to approach him and say, "Do you have any names you'd like to suggest?" And he said, "Only one, and I think this guy will do great for you, and it's W.A. Criswell," which they would not have even probably known about him. But again, it's sort of the turn of history. somebody cancels a meeting one day. Otherwise, he would have just been sitting in the audience, and McKinney and Hill, neither one would have ever even known of Criswell. But two out of the three churches that he pastors in his career will be a result of filling in when a canceled speaker comes along. So, sometimes you look at people that ultimately experience a lot of success, and you think, well, surely they're talented and they're ambitious, but had this battle just gone a little differently, would this general ever be famous? Or this preacher, if this guy hadn't canceled a meeting, would he have ever been known? I'm sure that wherever he ended up would have grown and been a decent church, but would he have ever reached the heights that he ultimately does? And so the other thing that Hawkins, his biographer, mentions early on is that his parents are quite divided when it comes to their views of pastors. And his father loves J. Frank Norris, who is the most famous Baptist fundamentalist in America at the time. He pastors First Baptist Fort Worth, and I studied a bit on Norris in my studies when I was in school, and he's a flamboyant, very compelling preacher. He's constantly attacking the liberalism that's creeping into the convention, but he has a way of drawing a crowd and causing controversy. When he was trying to build a bigger church, they were trying to raise money for that, and then his church building mysteriously burns down, and the insurance money and so on enables them to build a bigger building. And conveniences of history. He had a number of those conveniences. At one point, a guy threatens to kill. He gets so mad at Norris, he threatens to kill Norris. And so that man one day comes storming into Norris's office at the church, and Norris pulls a pistol out of his pastor's desk and shoots the man dead, shoots him multiple times. And then it's discovered the man didn't have a weapon. He threatened to kill Norris, but when he came to the office, he didn't have a gun, but Norris did, and Norris made short work of him. And so quite an interesting character. And W.A.'s father loves him, thinks he's the best man of God out there. But his mother hates Norris and thinks he's crude and rude and uncivilized. And she admires George Truett, George W. Truett, who is the pastor of First Dallas. And Truett is a denominational statesperson. He is a great preacher, but he's the kind of guy that is a denominational man. Norris is criticizing the denomination, saying it's all gone liberal. But Truett supports the denomination and is a friend of all the denominational leaders. And so he's seen as much more civilized. He keeps himself above the fray. So Hawkins says that Criswell sort of takes the best of both worlds. He is a fundamentalist in many ways. He has very conservative theology, but he likes to portray himself in public as more of a Truett. Of course, he's going to replace Truett as pastor of First Dallas, and so he always wants to appear as a statesman, not dirtying his hands in the muck and mire of conflict. And Hawkins will say Criswell likes to let his underlings do the dirty work for him while he kind of remains serenely above all the conflict. And so it's interesting to see those two. But ultimately, Hawkins says, but Norris is really who won out in Criswell. He was in spirit much more of a Norrisite. And so in 1944, George W. Truett is now quite elderly. He's been a pastor at First Dallas for 47 years. And then he dies of a very painful bone cancer ultimately. And that is a very sought-after pastorate, even though over the last several years, Truett has been declining, and his church has been declining. Criswell later says for about 15 to 17 years, the church has just been emptying out. And it's one of those things that's interesting. When Criswell finally arrives there, there's whole Sunday school buildings pretty well empty. They haven't been running any programs. They just have relied upon Truett's preaching, but he's in his 80s, and he's not the preacher he once was. But of course, he dies in the pulpit. Basically, he till right to the end, he's still getting up there and preaching, and his loyalists are very supportive of him. But the church has been waning on his watch in the latter years. And Criswell sees that. Criswell, when he's called, is going to overhaul everything. But interestingly, Criswell will he really wants to pass Truett. Truett was there 47 years. Criswell will linger around for 50 years, just so he's pastored longer. But he's 85 years old or so when he finally retires, and his church has been waning at that point. By that point, there's a bunch of big, booming mega churches out in the Dallas suburbs that are cutting edge, and First Dallas in downtown Dallas is getting old and tired, and as is Criswell. And so it's interesting, when he's young, he sees the consequences of an aging pastor that doesn't stay up to date or stays too long.
Yeah.
And in a sense, Criswell is going to do a similar thing. And so, but when he gets to this church, he has a vision that he always claimed that God gave him a dream where Truett was handing the church over to Criswell. And when he gets there, there's a lot of people concerned about him, that he's kind of a young firebrand from a much smaller church in Oklahoma. But he always kind of is fairly fortunate in a lot of things. And basically George Truett's right-hand man, a man, last name is Coleman, he very graciously endorses Criswell and publicly supports him and encourages everybody to rally around him. And so Criswell's very first sermon that he preaches, about 59 people joined the church, which is more than had joined in entire years previously. And in his first year there, 1,000 people will join the church, again, he comes at the end of 1944. So World War II is just coming to an end, and all the baby boomers are about to start getting born. And so Criswell comes in and says, we need to be a family church, a church that ministers to the entire family and that has age-graded Sunday schools and activities for all the kids. And ultimately, he's going to build this magnificent structure for the day where they'll have recreation buildings with gymnasiums and bowling alleys and skating rinks, and unheard of. It will become the envy of every Baptist preacher. Well, wouldn't it be nice to be First Dallas and have your own bowling lanes for the youth to go bowling, or roller skating rinks, and all these different things, and a gym to work out in, and so it's going to be, it'll become just the thing, the church that kind of sets the pace, and Sunday school classes that are well organized and perfectly designed for the baby boomer beginnings, and all those babies and kids are going to have a church that's fully prepared to service them. And the other thing that's really interesting with Criswell is that he's very fortunate in that he's got several very, very wealthy women in particular that love him and support him. And so as he's going to purchase about 8 square blocks of downtown Dallas to build their facilities and all these buildings and parking garages and other things. And on several occasions, at one point when he wanted to build this recreation building and skating rinks and bowling lanes, and there was going to be a parking garage attached to that, it's going to be several $1 million, and back in the 50s, and so the church kind of balks at that. They just don't have that kind of money. And so there's 3 women in particular, and one of the women is Minnie Slaughter Neal. She's a widow, very wealthy, and she's asked W.A., well, what is it you need to build? Show me the plans. And so he does, and she basically she buys that plot of land and she personally pays for that entire building. And so the church doesn't even know that she's doing that. The church can see that some kind of structure is going up, but they don't know what it is for, or who owns it, or anything. And then when this dream building with everything that pastor has longed for to be able to attract families to his church is finished, then she deeds it over to the church. And so he actually he's got 3 women that do that. Mary Crowley is another one later on. And so every time that there's a building he wants, a facility he wants, that the church doesn't think they can afford, he just lets one of these women know. And then all of a sudden he's got the money for it. And the third person is Ruth Hunt. And I met Ruth. Ruth Hunt has actually been in my house. She was married to H.L. Hunt, who at one point was considered perhaps the wealthiest man in the world. And she becomes his widow and has a lot of money. And her daughter, June Hunt, still goes to that church. In fact, I was speaking at First Dallas at a banquet last fall and ran into June Hunt. But they have given just millions and millions of dollars to the church. At one point, WA wants to build a new parking garage because they're in downtown Dallas, and so families have got to drive in and have a place to park. And I think that parking garage was going to cost about $7 million. And Criswell's an interesting guy because he when he came to the church, he came under 2 conditions. He said, the pulpit has to be mine. He said, I've got to be free to preach whatever I want, whatever I feel God tells me to. And secondly, the staff have to be mine. He said, they answer to me, and I can hire them, I can fire them. And at one staff retreat later on, he was asked, are you a dictator? And he said, well, I am a dictator, but I'm a benevolent dictator. But he prided himself in, I run this church. And,
which is what all dictators probably say.
Yeah, and he would just say, well, no one knows this church better than I do, and no one knows what's best for the church better than I do, and so I need the power to do that. And a lot of Baptist pastors, they followed that lead. They tried to follow and be a benevolent dictator of their church as well. And
I bet.
They had varying degrees of success with that, trying to be
sure.
like Criswell. What's interesting with Criswell is that he'll still have to get the approval of his deacon board. And there are times when the deacons will say no. And it's interesting because he sees himself as a dictator, but he still has to get the deacons to approve what he wants to do. And so, and also you find out later that his wife is the ultimate dictator. She has power over him, and he confesses at one point to his best friend that early on his wife was kind of playing her cards with him and saying, I'm not going to do this or go along with that, and unless you meet my demands. And she had a bunch of things that she insisted that Criswell agreed to. And he told his friend, she held a gun to my head, and I couldn't be divorced and be the pastor of First Dallas. And so I had to agree to it. And his wife is, in many ways, the power behind the throne. She's quite an interesting person. His wife actually taught a women's Sunday school class that I think got up to like 400 people would attend. And most of these wealthy widows that gave the money to the church were in her class. And so she would exert enormous influence over what she wanted. And a lot of things didn't happen unless she approved it. And if you were in her bad books, she had lots of ways of making your life very miserable. And
sounds sort of like the Vatican of Texas or something.
and so in fact later on when they're looking at trying to replace Criswell, at least bring in a younger person to work as kind of an heir apparent. If those people appeared to be a threat to Mrs. Criswell, she would run them off. And there were several that just realized I can't take her on. Even when WA was happy to have some young person under him, if his wife didn't approve, that person wasn't going to stay around. So, but anyway, he wants to build this parkade. It's going to cost $7 million. He's got another friend, Jack Pogue, who is a very wealthy real estate developer, and and when the deacons voted down, they just said we don't have $7 million to build a parking garage right now. This Jack works out a deal with WA where he says, I'll pay to build that garage, and then I'll rent. He owned an office building nearby. He said, I'll rent that garage space during the week, and then let your church have it on in the evenings and on the weekends. And he said, and then I'll pay rent to you for the use of the parkade. And Hawkins says at the time he wrote this book that the church had received over $50 million in rental revenue from that parking garage, and they didn't even have to pay to build it. The other guy built it. They got this free parking garage that met all their needs, and they've generated over $50 million of revenue.
Wow.
And so again, it was a wealthy person that loved WA, and so people have often said, and these wealthy people, every year they would give him a brand new vehicle every year. And they would pay, some of the wealthy folks would pay every year for him and his wife to go on an expensive European vacation for a month every year. And so he had some very wealthy people that just sort of enabled him to live as he wanted to and to have lots of influence, to build what he wanted to build. So he had state-of-the-art everything at the time. But sadly, and maybe just the one or two other things just to say that I think really influenced people. He became an exegetical preacher where he just loved to just preach through verses of the Bible, just verse by verse. And so he actually did something that a lot of pastors were quite envious of. Back in February of 1946, he announces he's going to preach through the Bible. And so 46, February, he starts with Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. And 17 years later, October 1963, he preaches out of the last verse in Revelation. He's preached from one end of the Bible to the other. It took 17 years. But that also became a model of, because everybody wanted to do what Criswell did. And so he's also a premillennial dispensationalist, and so he promotes that very kind of conservative view of Scripture and history. And ultimately, he's going to become, in essence, the godfather of the conservative resurgence in the Southern Baptist Convention. And he's going to be quite concerned about liberalism that's creeping into the seminaries and denominational institutions. And Paige Patterson is actually going to be running the Criswell Institute, which is basically a Bible college that Criswell founded. And Patterson is going to be, so he's basically going to be one of his lieutenants, and he's going to lead the charge to turn the whole tide of the Southern Baptist Convention to be more conservative. And at one point, when there's a lot of people alarmed at what Patterson is doing, apparently all 6 of the Southern Baptist seminary presidents came to Criswell's office and pled with him to stop Patterson, tell Patterson to stand down, to quit causing these conflicts. And Criswell apparently had said, I believe in what he's doing. I'm not going to tell him any such thing. And again, Criswell would preach some key sermons at pastors' conferences and so on. He certainly let people know that he believed it was good to become more conservative, but he didn't dirty his hands in the day-to-day. And that's had a huge influence as well. But and 2 things probably that were great regrets for him. One is he just had a hard time leaving. He wanted to stay 50 years. His wife was very, very dominant. And so you can imagine it'd be very, very difficult to replace him, to come in and take over, because he was still lingering around. And for a while there, the deal was, okay, Criswell will still preach Sunday mornings, and you can preach Sunday nights, and you can preach when he's out of town. But he's still there. His wife is still teaching her class into her 80s. And if they don't like what you're doing, then they'll make your life very miserable. And so had some very unfortunate things in trying to find his successor. It took a while to get someone that really finally he could kind of release the reins. and that was unfortunate because his church would also decline, and his buildings that had once been state of the art would in some ways deteriorate as well, and need some major overhauling by his successors. But maybe the saddest thing as well is just his family, and Hawkins is a big fan of Criswell's, but interestingly, he says, well, W.A. and Betty Criswell were a power couple of unmatched proportions in public. Behind the doors of the parsonage on Swiss Avenue was one of the most dysfunctional families imaginable. And apparently they had one child, a girl, Mabel Ann, and Hawkins speculates that she might have had some mental struggles, psychological problems, but their one daughter, and you could also imagine if you have a very, very domineering mother, like she had, very controlling, that you might have some problems. And Mabel gets married early while she's young, has a child, and then leaves her husband, leaves her son, and gets a divorce, which back in that day would have been scandalous. If you could imagine, you're this revered W.A. Criswell, and your only child is divorced and has abandoned her family. And she went for several years kind of abandoning her faith as well. Eventually, she comes back, gets married again, has another son, and then ultimately divorces that husband as well. And that husband, the ex-husband, and his son would sit in the pew beside Mrs. Criswell every Sunday, and then come to the Criswells' home for lunch. But Hawkins says that Mrs. Criswell could go years without even speaking to her daughter, just upset with her, embarrassed by her. And at certain points, apparently W.A. would actually secretly have lunch with his only daughter, but because he didn't want his wife to know, because it would make her upset. And kind of sadly, at the end of his life, when he is finally retired, Criswell spent about 49 days in the hospital. And when he finally is being released, he's in his 80s now, his wife, Betty, just didn't think that it would work for him to come home to their house. She still lived in the parsonage, and she had various reasons for that. But so his good friend Jack Pogue, who built the parkade for him, he's a lifelong bachelor, and he takes W.A. to live at his house. And ultimately, W.A. lives for 4 more years and spends 1,500 days at his friend's house. The last 4 years of his life. His wife still lives in the parsonage where they've lived for half a century, and she'll come over to visit her husband, but it's his good friend that cares for him every day, takes him out to lunch every day. And ultimately he dies in his friend's house, and not in his own house with his wife. And so just, people think, well, wouldn't that be awesome to have these wealthy tycoons like Don Carter that owned the Dallas Mavericks, and Mary Kay is a member of his church, and Ken Cooper, that's the huge fitness guru who has Cooper clinics, and Zig Ziglar is teaching a Sunday school class in the church auditorium. And to think, wow, if I had all these influential people in my congregation, just June Hunt and Ruth Hunt and all these people, what could I do? And you think, well, you've got to have the kind of personality that attracts people like that. Just because someone's wealthy doesn't mean that they're going to just give you millions of dollars. He obviously was a person of great charm and ability, but he also had a family life. He said later in life, he said that my great regret is that I neglected my family. The church was more important to me than family. But then he'll say, but I always felt called to be a pastor, and that was so all-consuming to me that you could just tell that was after God, the church really was his great love, and he poured his life into it, and then of course had a hard time walking away from it because he'd invested his whole life and really sacrificed perhaps his only child in the process. And so, a tragic figure in some ways who reached enormous heights. Rick Warren admired Criswell. It was kind of a role model for him of being a megachurch Baptist pastor and many people looked at his life and just said, oh, to have that kind of facility and those kind of resources and programming, but there's always a price, as we've seen, to pay to reach those heights. And so he leaves a legacy in many ways. People, certainly of my generation and before, that was what if you thought about the ultimate pastor, it was him. But even by his friends, as they write biographies, they acknowledge, though, it was not perfect and flawed. And of course, we've seen that with biographies. History is filled with flawed people that accomplish much.
Yeah. Well, what a great way to end, and fascinating character that we've looked at today. And we'll leave links to the biography that you used by Hawkins, and we'll leave links to that in the show notes. And until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.